We've got our guest who's joining us today, Tom Mohrman. How are you, Tom?
Good afternoon. I'm doing very well, thank you. I hope you're having a good show
Tech
so far.
Technology is great until sometimes it can throw us for a loop, and that's okay. But I'm excited about what you guys are up to because you guys have the Save Our Shells, which is Mississippi's oyster shell recycling program. And I'll have to say, Tom, the more people that hear about this, the more excited they get to be a part of it. We were just talking about different restaurants, although donuts is not part of the probably going to be part of the oyster, but there are many restaurants who are looking forward to be a part of it. So let's just get started. How did this come up? The Mississippi Sound Oyster Shell Recycling Program.
So thank you for having me on the show today. This is a project that was paid for by an award from the Mississippi Department of Environmental Quality in partnership with the Restore Council. So it's funded through oil spill money, essentially. And it's got a little bit of history in the state. There have been a couple efforts to get an oyster shell recycling program started along the coast. Some of those have been piloted by the Mississippi Commercial Fishers United, where they've been working with the Oyster Cook-Off Festival, collecting shells from that. But really, it's because of the funding that's been made through the Department of Environmental Quality and the Restore Council that's given us this opportunity to get started on a shell recycling program.
So I think some of us would think, well, how do you recycle them? What are you doing with them? Once they've been, eaten or, consumed, then what can they be made out of? What can they do? How can they be repurposed?
Sure. So oyster shell recycling is simply collecting shells that would otherwise be discarded and divert them from headed to a landfill. So we're trying to take a product that would ordinarily be thrown into the garbage and reuse that for restoration of oyster reefs. So one of the things in the life cycle of an oyster is they are planktonic. They float in the water for a couple weeks. And when they're triggered, they just sink to the bottom and land on the first thing that they find is where they are for their whole life. So one of the things that oyster shells are really good for is being a substrate or a place for a new oyster to grow. So putting oyster shells back into the water is a way to help make new baby oysters.
Which is a good thing, right? Like that would be a really good thing. And so the other, I guess the alternative, Tom, would be that these oyster shells would find their way into landfills or dumpsters. And then it's not really, it may be biodegradable, but it's not really doing any good there ever. So this is a way of giving it an opportunity. Is there ever too many oysters to put back?
Never. So we want to put as many oyster shells back into the water as we can.
So I know y'all are looking for more restaurants to sort of jump on board to sort of do this. So what's like the expectation of the restaurant? Do they put their oyster shells in a different bucket? How does that work?
So it's kind of up to them at this point to decide how they want to collect their own shells based on how they operate their kitchens and manage their facility. What our program will do is we'll collect those oyster shells from them once they're outside of their kitchen or facility. We will be working with a collection contractor at some point in the future, and we'll be enrolling restaurants to participate in this program. So we'll collect the shells and we'll deliver them to the most likely place will be the Mississippi Department of Marine Resources, where they can be incorporated into their restoration activities.
And is this like a one-time pickup, or will this kind of be like, how you have your regular sort of garbage pickup? Although I don't want to, put oyster shells in the same thing as garbage, but I guess technically that's where they would have ended up. Or will we kind of like you call once you get a certain number and then they come and get it? Or is it still just how it works out for each individual restaurant?
It will probably be likely based on the needs of the individual restaurants, but we'll probably be working to get a regular schedule. So we'll try to make pickup days multiple times a week. Sanitation at a restaurant facility is very important to obviously the restaurant, and we want to be an excellent partner in making sure that all those considerations and concerns are addressed.
I was reading where I think just based on 26 restaurants, man, it's an estimated 5 million oysters are sold annually. That's mind-boggling to me, the amount of oysters that's actually sold and enjoyed on the Gulf Coast.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. And so this is the The collection phase of this project is actually the second phase, and the first part was an economic and sustainability study. So we wanted to see how much it would cost to run a program and how much material was out there in the world. And we had 26 restaurants out of 51 that sell oysters participate. And through that, we were able to extrapolate that there's about 5 million oysters shucked annually in Mississippi. And that's about 1.5 million pounds of material that's available. So.
Do those oysters come from our shores also, or are they coming from other places? And does that matter if they're going back into our sea, if that makes sense?
It doesn't necessarily matter right now. So a lot of the oysters we eat in Mississippi come from Texas, Louisiana. There are some oyster farms that grow them locally, and there's also still some wild caught oysters being harvested. But it doesn't necessarily matter to me where those shells are coming from because they seem to serve the same purpose once they get back into the water.
How often will you guys be spreading them back out into the ocean? I feel like it would be one big dump, or is it in smaller? Is that sort of organized as well?
I think that's yet to be determined. One of the reasons we are wanting to partner with the state on this is because they already have a lot of the mechanisms in place to do that kind of distribution. And this is essentially a pilot phase. We're trying to figure out the costs and of what it will be to actually run the program, but also we want to know what kind of material we're going to get. So being very streamlined and economically efficient will be key to the longevity of a program in the state.
Well, I think there's nothing but good that's coming out of this. Number one, you're just keeping 1.2 million pounds out of the dumpsters or the landfills and trying to putting them back to good use. I know your organization does a lot of other good things. Tom, can you hang with us? We'll chat a little more.
Absolutely.
All righty.
Thank you.
You guys stick with us. We got more for you coming up next. We're continuing our conversation with Tom. He's the Director of Marine Programs for the Mississippi Department of Environmental Quality or the Nature Conservancy. Sorry, that's the part that you are. But this is a partnership with the Department of Environmental Quality. I always say equality, which is probably not a bad thing, but it's quality, Tom. And you're talking about save our shells. Okay, so we were talking about dumping them back into the ocean, obviously, to regenerate baby oysters, which I think is great. But some people on our text line are curious about other ways of recycling them into good uses, which one said using ground oyster shells for like the diets of laying hens, and others say in Louisiana they make roads from oyster shells. Or if you get the 1 point something billion tons, does this program put them all back into the ocean, or are there other ideas of how to utilize these shells for good things?
Yeah, so oyster shells have been used for a wide variety of reasons, and putting them with chicken feed is one of them. Historically, a lot of the roads were actually paved with oyster shells. In Biloxi, you can still see this today if you dig down a little bit. But the aim of this project is to help restore oysters in Mississippi, which have been in decline for a couple decades now for a variety of environmental and man-made causes. And
So we want to put those bad boys back so babies can have a place too. It's the maternity ward. So it'd be the maternity ward for future oysters. What is the life cycle of, I guess, creating an oyster to, being one that can be harvested for consumption? Is it, does it take months? Does it take years? Like, what does that sort of look like?
Well, it depends a lot on the water, but typically, you start with an adult oyster and it releases larvae into the water. That larva takes a couple weeks, it floats around, finds a new home, and then is triggered to just fall out of the water, and wherever it lands, like I was saying before, is where it lives forever. And it goes through a couple growth stages where it gets bigger, and it's in that location forever. They're filter feeders, so they process water through their body. They open up their shells, and there's the mollusk inside. And it can take, about 1.5 to 2 years in some places to grow to an adult oyster. And it's going to depend on things like water temperature, salinity, and water quality. And also where you are in the world makes a difference. So if you're, say, in the Northeast or Northwest, those take a little bit longer to grow than, say, in the South Atlantic or the Gulf of Mexico.
So you can understand why it's not a quick return. So it kind of takes an investment to sort of have an opportunity for us to up our production of oysters. It's not just the 9 months or 6 months or whatever sort of cycle. You have to really sort of take care of them and give them time. You can also see why the numbers can dwindle quick. I mean, if people's, demand for oysters goes up and it exceeds the ability for Mother Nature to, to make new ones, then that math doesn't add up, right, Tom?
Yeah, absolutely. You're never going to quench the demand for oyster products in the food market. And aquaculture is playing a big role in helping to support that. But oysters are also a natural habitat. They provide a lot of what we call ecosystem benefits. So those are things like fisheries habitat for small fin fish and invertebrates. Those attract recreational fish that people like to go after. And as I mentioned before, oysters are known as really good filter feeders and can help remove nutrients from our coastal waters. So there's a lot of benefits to them. The economical, definitely, it plays a big part in Mississippi, but also the environmental contributions to fish and wildlife are really important.
Who knew all this about a nice little oyster that we usually enjoy? And I think season's kind of approaching. I'm not sure when is the oyster eating season, at least for us here in Mississippi.
Well, I'm not an expert in this regard because it used to be a rule about months ending in R, but with aquaculture farms now that's changed a little bit. But uh, I think it's
Summer
almost a year
season.
round. Yeah.
Well, I think they're
So
best suited sitting on the beaches at the Mississippi Gulf Coast, feeling the breeze and eating them when it's a little bit warmer than 30 degrees outside. That just really doesn't set the stage for oysters. It feels like it's a seasonal food, even if maybe it can be sort of year round. Usually, when you start crawfish season, you're starting to inch into your oyster and your shrimp season sort of as well. But oysters isn't the only thing you guys do there and part of your marine programs for the Nature Conservancy, Tom. What a cool job that you have. So, other than trying to save the oysters or save our shells, what else are you guys up to?
So the Nature Conservancy in general is a nonprofit organization with offices in all 50 states. Our mission is to conserve lands and waters that are essentially vital to life. Our Mississippi chapter has a focus on freshwater, forest, and coastal conservation. And our marine program is working on a couple different programs or projects. We're working on oyster restoration to help create a subtidal oyster reef in the Bay of St. Louis, and we're also looking to do some living shoreline work in the near future as well. Um, we've done some other works with turtles and stream restoration projects in the past. So pretty much my area of interest is the lower three coastal counties and the tributary waters that pour into Mississippi Sound.
We talk about all the time the importance of the Mississippi Gulf Coast from an economic standpoint, obviously for the state of Mississippi, but also just from the marine standpoint, how important taking care of our waterways not only is for Mississippi, but for, the ocean connects to sort of everybody. So how important is it to focus efforts on sustainability, conservancy, sort of taking care of these creatures and critters or byways and, bayous that maybe we don't think about in our everyday life, but they kind of factor into how we enjoy life overall.
Sure. Everything that happens on land ultimately affects what happens in the water. You've probably heard about the dead zone out in Louisiana. And what a lot of people don't realize is the Mississippi River basically drains about two-thirds of the nation. So things that happen in the Midwest and other parts of the country come downstream. And to a kind of a smaller scale of that in Mississippi, our coastal streams also pour into the Gulf of Mexico ultimately. So it's important to keep an eye on the health of these habitats. And one of the good things about this Save Our Shells program is it's a way to connect people to that conservation. When you're in a restaurant, you're giving somebody the opportunity to recycle an oyster shell. That may seem like a small thing at the time, but really you're participating in a chain of events that takes that shell back into the water and hopefully recycles some of the value that a commercial fisherman might have or an aquaculture person or the habitat itself. And you may see uh, oysters from that recycled shell in the future on your plate again.
Tom, as consumers, obviously, I don't own a restaurant and I don't fish for oysters. I do enjoy eating them, though. That is something I do enjoy. Would it be fair for us just to ask, not aggressively, but just to kindly ask if we go out to a restaurant that has oysters on the Mississippi Gulf Coast and say, hey, are you guys part of the Save Our Shells program? I'd love for my contribution to be going back into, the waterways, and then opening that conversation? Or are you guys out there knocking on doors and sort of taking care of that for us?
So, good question. So right now, we haven't begun our official enrollment. We've talked to a couple of restaurants, and obviously a year ago, we spoke to about 26 of them, and we're revisiting those folks now. But we're hoping to get started on collection around early to mid-April. So I wouldn't start asking folks just yet. But we're kind of doing a soft launch at the 7th annual Mississippi Gulf Coast Oyster Fest, which is going to be at Point Cadet, Biloxi on March 25th, I believe. It's a Saturday. So we'll be collecting shells from the chefs that are there for that cook-off. And then hopefully by early April, we will be collecting shells from restaurants. And then at that point, please encourage your restaurants to participate in it. For this program to work, we need as many participants as possible. We've got some target goals that we're aiming for. There are 51 restaurants out there that we probably more like 52 or 3 now that we know have the oyster shells or oysters on a half shell that we're looking for. And we've gotten a real good response from those that we've talked to already. I think the more we do our job of getting the word out, the more participation we're going to have. So right now it's kind of in our court to get those guys on board, but in the future, I'll be happy if you all mention it. So
I'd love to see signage for restaurants if they wanted to put it up saying that they participate and Save Our Shells. As a consumer, when you see Mississippi farm-raised catfish or you see Mississippi Gulf Coast seafood, it makes you proud about where you're spending your money. I'd love to know that, my dozen oysters and my Bloody Mary was going back into doing something good. Well, Tom, I think this is just the first of probably many conversations I'd love to keep up with and see how things are going back in spring, early summer. So welcome back anytime you're ready.
I thank you very much, and I appreciate the time on your show. Thank you.
All righty. You guys stick with us. We got some more good things for you coming up next.